Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading issue number 121. But before we get into that, just a little catch-up. In the last issue, we saw the 10th anniversary of Hellblazer as a comic book, and we got this really interesting, kind of weird issue where we were actually part of the issue, and John took us, the reader, on a little tour of his world, and we got to meet some people we hadn't met before and some ones we had. But all of them kind of said the same thing to us when we saw them. It was, stay away from John, he's dangerous. You're gonna end up dead. But we stuck with John through it all, and we ended up not dying. We just, at the end, had a pint with John and a bunch of friends. And on the last page, we even saw Sean Phillips, the main artist of the Paul Jenkins run, because that was his last issue on this run. And I should say that this run is ending in about 9 issues now. And I believe after that, Garth Ennis returns with a small story arc, and then we're on to the Warren Ellis run. So very fun, very exciting stuff. But anyway, first things first with issue 121, we got the cover. We see a TV and someone is changing the channel with the remote. And on the screen of the TV, looking like he's trapped in the box itself, is John Constantine. And one nice thing is that Sean Phillips has still continued to do the covers, so they are just as good as ever. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Warren Pleece. We start off on the first page with someone inside of a house. They're sitting next to a telephone that has a message machine that is saying, "Hi, you've reached the answering thingy of Pam and Gavin. We're not around to take your call right now. Stop it, Gav. So leave a message." And then the message begins to repeat again, and we hear a click, and we're not really sure where that's coming from, but it is happening every time the message plays. Then we cut to the eyes of the person who is sitting in the chair next to the phone, and they are like bulging out of their head, like they're listening intently to the message. Then we get some panels that are a flash of memory from this person, and we see a man driving with a woman in the passenger seat, and they are behind a work truck that is carrying building materials, including long metal pipes. And it looks like the man loses control of the car and ends up running into the back of this truck, and one of those pipes goes through the woman's head. Then we turn the page and we see that clicking noise that was happening that I thought maybe was the recorder like rewinding or something is actually the sound of a hammer on a revolver. And we see the person has been cocking and decocking this handgun every time the message repeats. And in their other hand, we see a picture. And in that picture, it looks like a man and a woman are in the center. We see Chaz on the very left and John Constantine on the very right. And we also see teardrops are streaming down the glass on this picture frame. Then we see the gun being brought up to the person's head, and we now can see that this is a man, and it is the man who was in that driver's seat and who is also the man in the picture, and we can assume that Pam is the woman in the picture, and she died in that horrible accident, and he is about to kill himself. Then we turn the page, and we cut to a club with a punk band playing, and I believe the name of the band is Carcinoma, and it looks like Rich is the lead singer, and he's screaming the words, 12-car pile up right in front of me. Bodies in the wreckage, brains in a tree. 12-car pile up, 12-car pile up. Then we cut to John in the audience who is rubbing his head, like maybe he's got a headache or something. And his back is actually turned to the stage because he's at the bar and he's leaning on it. And Danny is standing next to him with a drink in her hand, and she's smiling like she's enjoying the show. And John's narration is saying, "It was Protagoras, I think it was, who first came up with the curious notion that man is the measure of all things. Stupid git. It's a safe bet he never drank in this boozer, or he'd have revised that theory quite considerably. Either that, or he'd be measuring in millimeters." And we see on this page that the name of this issue is Up the Down Staircase, Part 1. And as we turn the page, we're still in the club, the band is still playing, and Danny is yelling to John, "So what do you say then, hun?" And John yells back, "What?" And she leans forward and yells in his ear, "America! Family!" And John looks at her and says, "What? I can't hear a bloody thing, Danny." And she screams, Thanksgiving, John. You said you'd let me know? And then John finally gets it and he says, oh yeah, right. No problem. And then she screams, what? And then just as John is about to answer her, the band finishes their song and John yells, I said, anywhere's better than this fucking shit. And like I said, the band had stopped playing right as John said that. So we see Rich looking kind of sad because he thinks that John was saying that his music is shit. Then we turn the page and we cut to New York City. They're kind of showing us all these different landmarks like the Statue of Liberty and the Twin Towers and a couple shots of people just walking on the street. And over these panels, John's narration says, it's in the air and it stinks. It's neon and ozone. It's the latest 200 kicks on a guy with a 3-inch vertical. It's hype and glare and garish plastic packing. It's the stench of claustrophobic jerk-off booths mixed with rotten bread and honey-glazed ham. It's a clever catchphrase that really gets under your skin. It's a very nasty, itchy disease. And it's spreading. Then we cut to inside of an airplane where we see John and Danny, and they're sitting next to each other, and John's narration continues saying, 8 hours into my return trip to the colonies, and I finally worked out once and for all what I don't like about flying. Everything. Then we get a shot of a giant screen in the front of the plane that all the passengers are watching, and on it is an infomercial for something that will give you good abs. And as John stares at this, his narration continues saying, for the last hour, some scrawny American bint's been trying to palm off a personal torture device known as the Abdominator. Call me a cynic, but the life-affirming product in question looks suspiciously like a piece of plastic left over from a Cold War bomb shelter. I mean, who in their right mind would want one? And as his narration says this, we cut to the faces of everybody watching the screen on the plane, and they look very enthralled by what they're watching. Then we cut back to John and Danny, and John now has a blanket over his head, so he can't stare at the screen. And I should mention that Danny is actually writing on her computer, so she's not looking at the screen either. And John's narration continues saying, ah well, it's either the boredom finally kicking in, or nicotine deprivation, but I think I'm going slightly mad. Although you can never rule out the after effects of lukewarm airline food. And as his narration says this, we get a panel where we zoom in on one of the passengers, and it's a man, and there's some kind of weird orange smoke coming out of their mouth, almost like they're being possessed or something. Then we see the stewardess going down the aisles, and she sees two men standing up, and she says, oh, excuse me, gentlemen, would you please return to your... But she's cut off as the men begin to scream at each other, saying, he was framed! It was a conspiracy! Then what about the bloody glove, you numbskull? No way, man! I watched the whole thing! Yeah? Well, so did I! And I'm not 100% sure, but it sounds like the men are arguing about O.J. Simpson. And the man who was saying he was guilty attacks the man he was arguing with and ends up actually knocking over the stewardess. And both men fall to the ground in the aisle, and they are actually pulled apart by other passengers. And as he's being pulled away, the man who attacked says, it was all there, 8 hours a day. I saw the whole thing from beginning till end. Then another passenger who's just sitting nearby says, I videotaped it. Then we turn the page and we cut to the plane having landed and everybody's disembarking, but specifically we see the two men who were fighting are being escorted off the plane by police. And as the other passengers get off from the plane, we see the stewardess is repeating, thank you, have a nice day. Thank you, have a nice day. Thank you, have a nice day. To everybody coming off the plane. Then we cut to John and Danny walking through the airport, and Danny says, was that the weirdest flight or what? If I never have another experience like that, it'll be too soon. And then John says, don't get your hopes up. Then we see there's a couple people behind John and Danny, and they're standing on those moving walkways, and we see the people behind them are talking, and it's a husband and wife, and the husband is saying, so she says, I'll bring out the pesky in your cat, and I'm saying, exactly how much pesky? So it's a pretty mundane conversation happening behind them, but we also see a third person just behind that couple, and they are in a black trench coat and a black fedora, and they are on fire. But no one is really noticing them, and John just happens to glance back, and he sees this man, but then it seems like he doesn't register it right away because he turns forward again, but then his eyes get really big and he says, bloody hell. And then he turns back again to look, but the man in the black trench coat on fire is no longer there. And then Danny looks at John and asks, "You with me, babe?" And John replies, "Thought I saw someone." And we couldn't really see the face of the man in the trench coat on fire. Most of it was shadowed, but we did see it looked like the person was black. Then we turn the page and we cut to the bustling city of New York, and it's nighttime now, and John's narration says, "It's the moon over Manhattan, a picture postcard night. It's the rattle and hum of busy restaurants, the steady drone of neon signs, the faint stink of antiseptic. It's the judicious application of makeup, just enough to cover the sores." Then we see John walking into a pub, and we've seen this pub before. It is the Blarney Stone, and this was the pub that appeared in the Damnation's Flame story arc from the Garth Ennis run, where John went to New York and had his final battle with Papa Midnight. It looks like something's wrong because there's no one else in the bar except John, and the bar stools are even upside down on top of the bar like the place is closed. But apparently it is open because the pub owner sees John and he says, "Problem, bud?" And John answers, "I don't know, mate. Where is everybody? I mean, I've been trying all night to get in touch with some of me old mates, and everyone's either dropped dead or buggered off." Then the pub owner walks from behind the bar, and he goes to the front door and he says, "If they have any sense, they're a million miles away. Used to be this place had some character. Nowadays, you can't even get a good porno without some watchdog brigade busting your balls." And then John comes over to the front door, and the man points down to a bloodstain on the ground and says, "I mean, see that? This girl in here tonight, she's going off on the Giants, right? And next thing you know, some asshole takes offense and wham! Breaks the glass right in her face." And as John walks out the front door, he says sarcastically, "Yeah, well, give that fan a contract, eh?" Then we see John walking down the sidewalk, and his narration says, "There's very definitely something rotten in the core of the Big Apple. More than the usual smell of piss and pilchards, anyway. New York City has always been the armpit of creation, but that's been part of the attraction, I suppose. It's still an armpit, but someone's given it a wax job and deodorant." So we see John go to an apartment building, and he looks on the outside name list, and he pushes a button to buzz up, and then he waits, and he doesn't hear anything, and he looks up at the window. He's expecting the light to come on, and he says, "Oh, come on, mate. You're always home." And then someone from below John says, "Wouldn't bother if I was you, boy. Ain't nobody there." And John turns and looks down to see a homeless man sitting next to the building, and John says, "How would you know then?" And the homeless man stands up and says, "Beats me." And then he looks up at the moon and says, "You see that up there? It ain't real. It's a marketing ploy. Someone dished out a lot of money to make it look good and shiny like that." And then he gets real close to John and pokes him in the chest and says, "They got you fooled, boy. Everyone fooled. That's why anyone with half a brain has left the town." And John asks, "Why are you still here then?" And as the homeless man turns and walks away, he says, "Like I said, anyone with half a brain." Then we turn the page and we cut to the next day, where John and Danny are on a train and they're going out to the country, it looks like. And we see they're kind of arguing as they're sitting next to each other because there's a no smoking sign on the train, but John is opening a new pack of cigarettes and Danny's saying, "Give it up, John. The fine's like $50. Politically correct bullshit. You can't smoke anywhere in public these days. What's going on around here? I mean, you go away for a couple years, and when you come back, you have no idea what the hell anyone's even talking about." And we see as the train's moving along, kind of through the middle of nowhere, the man from the airport, the one who was wearing the flaming trench coat, is standing outside by the tracks, and as Danny's talking, John is looking out the window, and his narration says, "Danny's instincts are spot on as usual. Ever since we got off the plane, I've had this sneaking suspicion that someone's been fiddling with the minds of the great unwashed. Still, it's always a little disconcerting when the actual culprit zips by at 60 miles an hour." So as John is looking out the window, he sees the man in the trench coat, and his eyes get really wide, and he says, "I don't believe it. I don't bloody believe it. You bastard!" And then he pushes himself against the window to see if he can get a better look at the person, and the guy in the trench coat just waves at him. Then we turn the page and we cut to John and Danny walking up to a house with their luggage, and John's narration says, "Well, that just about confirms it. The Ayatollah was right. America is well and truly fucked. Hope they had the sense to keep their legs closed out here in the boonies. So it seems like John knows who that person was, but we still don't know who it was because the man was still in shadows when he was outside of the train. And as they approach the house, we do see there is a man sitting on the porch, and he is an elderly black man. And as Danny and John move up the porch steps, Danny goes over to him and kisses him on the forehead and says, "Hi, Gramps. Still waiting for the mailman?" And then she turns and kind of motions with her hand to John and says, "Gramps, I want you to meet my boyfriend, John. Mom must have told you about him before. He's from England." And Grandpa just kind of looks at John and says, "Uh-huh." And then they walk past him and move into the house. And then the grandpa yells to the inside of the house and says, "Hey, Mary, you better get your big pans out and cancel the turkey. Go brung herself home a white boy." Then we cut to the inside and we see Danny hugging her mom. And John's narration says, "Danny's mom, Mary, covers us in happy tears, kisses, and self-rising flour as soon as we walk into the kitchen door." And we see as she runs to Danny and gives her a hug and kisses her, she yells out, "Baby." Then we cut to a little while later as Danny and her mom talk in the kitchen, and we see John is just kind of sitting in the living room, and there's another man who's sleeping on the couch in front of the TV. And John's narration says, "Going to the front room, there's Uncle Fred the insomniac and his best friend the telly. And on the television, there's some commercial that's saying, 'Introducing the revolutionary new Rat Be Gone.'" Then we see some more people walking into the kitchen, and it is a younger black man and a white woman. And John's narration says, "Thank God for small mercies, though. Namely, Cousin Terrell and his Walking Dead bloody wife, whose name no one can ever remember. Before you know it, all attention's diverted away from me and onto the late arrivals. I make good my escape to the front room and mindless bloody television. Although, I'm tempted to stay in the kitchen and watch Terrell's wife try to make friends with Gramps." So we see Gramps go in the kitchen, and he seems to not like this younger couple. And as he goes by Terrell's wife, he farts. Then we cut to later that evening, and we see everybody's in the living room watching TV. And John's narration says, "Before you know it, though, suicidal thoughts are creeping in. At great risk of physical harm, I've declared that basketball is the shittiest game in the world." And we see on the TV that they're watching basketball. And then in the next panel, we see John's narration say, "Next to fucking ice hockey." And then we hear the TV say, "Gretzky shoots! He scores!" So basically, John's being forced to watch a bunch of North American sports that he does not like. We see outside on the porch that Grandpa is sitting out there drinking, and we see a car pull up in the driveway, and Grandpa yells inside, "Boys are home." And then Danny rushes to the window and moves the curtain aside to look out. And with a big smile on her face, she says, "Oh, geez, look at that, would you?" Then we see two young men enter the house, and they seem to have had some serious injuries because both of them are wearing casts on their arms, and they have like bandages on their heads and stuff. And as they walk in, Danny says, "John, I'd like you to meet Ethan and Eldrick." And the brother in front looks at John and says, "Sup?" And the two brothers walk past him, and then another brother comes through the door, and he's got crutches, and Danny says, "And this is their older brother, Kyle. Oh my God." And Kyle kind of says under his breath as he moves past them, "Hey." And then Danny goes over to her mom and says, "Ma, I gotta ask." And the mom, who's just kind of staring at the boys annoyed, says, "I'd whoop their asses. Only they do a pretty good job of it themselves. Little fool's been watching the X Games again." And then Terrell points to Kyle, who's sitting down in a chair, and he says, "I told him you can't make a bungee cord out of a garden hose." Then we turn the page, and we get a scene of extreme violence at a hockey match. We see a bunch of fans cheering for two players who are fighting, and over these panels, the narration says, "It's 27 million for 3 rounds of cannibalism. It's ultimate fighting on pay-per-view. It's 110%. 10 for the agent, 100 for the lawyer. Cheap at twice the price because somewhere, someone's getting away with murder." And under this narration, the panel shows one of the men who was fighting falls down bloody to the ice. Then we see John wake up in a fright, and it seems that this imagery was a dream he was having. And he wakes up saying, "Oh." And I guess this wakes Danny up, but she doesn't really move. She just says, "Hon, shut the fuck up and go have a smoke on the porch, okay?" So John listens to her, and he goes down the stairs, And as he walks past the living room, we see that Uncle Fred is still watching TV in the living room, except now he is awake. And John goes past that room and outside, and he sits in the chair that Grandpa was sitting on earlier, and he begins to smoke. And John's narration says, "Downstairs, Uncle Fred's finally awake. Hallway smells of puff pastry and cheese doodles. Telly confirms that Madison Avenue is a universe unto itself." And we see the television in the living room is saying, "With the AccuDrive 2000, you'll be hitting it onto the sweet spot every time." And as John puffs, his narration continues, "Cigarette tastes brilliant. Air's cold and full of 3-word catchphrases. Hair's up on the back of my neck. It's coming. It's following me here from the city. I can feel it." And as John sits back and smokes, we can hear through the window the TV still, and the commercial finishes saying, "Experience the difference." And then the show comes back on, and we hear someone say, "And we're back, asking the question, has America flipped its lid? My next guest is a noted expert." And then some time passes as John smokes, and then John hears the guest on the TV say, "No doubt about it, Jerry. Society's going down the drain, and its decline can be easily traced to one man. And that man is John Constantine." And of course, John instantly stops smoking, and he looks behind him towards the window. And then we turn the page, and we see John is rushing inside into the living room, and he's saying, "Shit, what's going on?" And as he comes into the living room, we see Fred is in his chair. And if you remember on the airplane earlier, there was a man who had this weird orange smoke coming out of his mouth and eyes and stuff. And that's happening to Fred. All this smoke's coming out of his body, and he has his hand up to his head like it's a gun, and he's going to pull the trigger. And on the TV, we hear the guest say, "Oh yes, Constantine's a complete plank, really. I wouldn't touch the scruffy little souse git with a barge pole." But John doesn't really look at the TV. He's more concerned with Fred, and he kind of walks up to him slowly and asks, "Fred?" And as Fred sits there, he says, "Get rid of unwanted soap scum." Then from behind John, someone sitting in one of the chairs says, "Just my luck. The happy wanderer." And John turns around, and when he sees the man, we don't see who it is, but John seems to know because he says, "Just my luck. The lone wanker." Then we turn the page, and we get a panel of who I believe is supposed to be the First of the Fallen, but it is an African-American version of the First of the Fallen. He's got a very similar face, but he's black, and he has long dreadlocks, and he's wearing a suit, and he says to John, "Hello, John. Love your new girlfriend." And then he picks up a TV remote, and he points it at Uncle Fred, and he looks like he pushes a button, and we see Uncle Fred lift out of the chair and begin to levitate in front of them, and we see all the orange, smoky stuff swirling around them, and the first continues saying, "And I can see her family is going to be loads of fun." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, at gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.